Hey fellow fishing fanatic. So you heard the old timers at the bait shop or at the dock, and it sounded like they were speaking some kind of foreign language. You'd never heard of the terms that they were using, but you're pretty sure they were talking about fishing. Well, I'm about to help you understand the fishing terms. Now, granted, this is an ancient language that we really need to dive deep into, so be prepared for an extended video, but I'm telling you, it's gonna be worth it. You're gonna enjoy it, and by the end of it, you're gonna be able to understand what the heck the old timers are talking about. So let's get started. My name is Wes Littlefield with anglers.com, and fishing terms can be kind of complicated, or they can be kind of weird at times. I've got to admit that. I grew up around it, so I understand it, but if you didn't, it can be very confusing. So if you find that this content helps you, I would appreciate that you subscribe and go ahead and leave me a comment of your favorite term. So the first one we're gonna start with is action. Now this is how the rod actually bends. That's all that they're talking about. There's different strengths, different powers, but the action of the rod is just how it bends. Term number 2 that we're gonna go to is angler. I think you know what an angler is. It's somebody who spends way too much money, way too much time waiting for a bite, and most of the time they don't ever get it. You know, it's somebody that can fail over and over again and have a good day. That's what an angler is. Artificial bait is the next term. All that we're talking about with artificial bait is something man-made that you use to catch fish. So if you're using like a crankbait, a spinner bait, any of those kind of baits, that's artificial bait. Now if you're using minnows, live bait, that's not artificial bait. That's the differences. Backlash. If you've ever thrown a bait caster, then you know what this is. This is that annoying bird's nest that you get in your reel that takes forever to get out, and it's really frustrating. That's all I can say. Some people call it bird's nesting, some people call it backlashing, some people call it professional overrun. They all mean the same thing. It's that annoying little clump of line that you get from when your line just gets all tangled up casting a bait caster. Bail, and I don't mean like bailing your buddy out of jail. I actually mean the part of the reel on a spinning reel, the wire part of the reel that you open up in order to cast. That's called the bail of the reel, not bailing your buddy out of jail. Bait fish. I find I use this term a lot, and I've never really defined it, but other people might have bait fish definition different than mine. But a bait fish is anything that a predator fish is gonna eat. So that could be minnows, that could be shad, that could be bluegill, perch if you're up a little bit further north than I am. I mean, there's a bunch of different kinds of bait fish, but I call bait fish just what a fish is gonna eat, what you could use for bait. Barb. No, this isn't your Aunt Barb that you had Christmas dinner with once a year. This is the part of the hook that actually keeps the fish on. And in some places, you actually have to take the barb off or close the barb down in order to be legal. But it's the part of the hook that just kind of comes out a little bit and it holds the fish on there just a little bit better. That is the barb, not your aunt. Beds. Beds, when we're talking, are when a fish, specifically bass in this case, actually make like a circular little area in the water, and they sweep it and fan it away and clean it up to where they can lay their eggs. That's all we're talking about. During the spawn, bass will make beds, and that is the area that they lay their eggs in. Black bass. This is a few different species of bass, but generally, if we're talking black bass, it's largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, spotted bass, and all the kind of hybrids and everything in between those three. A bobber. It's usually a piece of plastic, piece of foam that floats out there. It's usually brightly colored, so you can see it go under when you get a bite, when you're fishing a jig or live bait. Braided fishing line. This is just a type of fishing line that's used. It's really strong. It's a smaller diameter. Even though it's smaller, it's stronger for the diameter size. So compared to like a monofilament line that's the same diameter, braided line would be much stronger. It's used in many different applications. You don't have to use it, but in certain scenarios, it's very helpful. A brush pile, just a generic term of any kind of woody structure. So if there's a tree that's fallen over into the water and sank to the bottom, that's a brush pile. If somebody sank their old Christmas tree in the lake, that's a brush pile. It's a very generic term just for structure underwater that fish really hang out around. Bottom fishing. It's literally when you're letting your lure, your bait, whatever, sink all the way to the bottom and set on the bottom, and maybe you're dragging it across the bottom, but you're staying in contact with the bottom of whatever area you're fishing, whether that's the pond, a lake, whatever. Channel. The channel is where a river or a creek runs. So if you were to drain your lake, you would still have creeks and rivers running through there if it's a man-made lake. And that channel, that deep area where the river and the creeks run, that is the channels. Clarity. Water clarity, we can call it water clarity, but it's literally how clear the water is for that specific area. Now, if you come to my local lake, it'll be a different clarity than your local lake. So you have to really judge the clarity of the water by the body of water that you're on. Cover. I consider cover anything that's really on top of the water that you've got to get your lure underneath and that where the fish are hanging out at. So cover can be a dock, or cover could be a grass mat, lily pads. That would be cover, in my opinion, where the fish are going to be underneath it hanging out. A dink. Now, I know you're a much better angler than I am, but I catch a lot of dinks. And when I mean dink, I mean little bitty fish. That's a dink. It's just a small fish. A donkey. No, this ain't like Shrek and we've got a donkey or talking donkey in the background or annoying donkey. I'm literally talking about a big fish now. Or in other words, it's a big bass. Yes, it's a big bass. Drift fishing, and it's literally when you let the wind push you and you just kind of drag your baits back behind you, maybe over a flat, maybe over the channel, along the channel, whatever, but you're literally just drifting across the lake. Now, obviously you need a boat to do this, so I wouldn't recommend, tying your floaties together and trying to float across it, drift fishing, but if you can do that, more power to you. Drop off. I consider a drop off a steep level change, a steep depth change. So we've got a flat and then we hit the channel, and that's the drop off point right there. It's kind of like a ledge. Sometimes it's not as drastic. It kind of depends on the water, the body of water that you're fishing, obviously. But a drop off, it can go from 2 to 10 feet, or it can go from 2 to 5 feet really quickly, but that's the drop off. Electronics. Now this is for all you boat anglers out there. They've got electronics. So this can mean your fish finder, this can mean your GPS, this can mean your phone, your camera, whatever you've got taken with you, it's your electronics. Typically though, when anglers are talking electronics, it's their fish finder, it's live scope, it's their trolling motor. So that's what they mean when they're talking about electronics. Finesse fishing. Finesse fishing to me is going much lighter lines, typically a spinning reel, and much smaller lures, more gentle presentation. So finesse fishing is taking the spinnerbait out there with a drop shot or even a shaky head and slowly fishing it, slowing way down, fishing much slower than you would ever think you'd need to. Fluorocarbon. This is another fishing line, and it's my least favorite, even though it's very beneficial. It's really hard to fish with if you fish just straight fluorocarbon, so I recommend using a fluoro leader instead of putting all the fluorocarbon on your reel. Just using a leader, that'll save you a lot of heartache, I promise. Game fish, but it's typically the ones that anglers fish for the most. So that's gonna be like your bass, your walleye. Fish that people typically fish for are game fish. A hammer, that's my nickname. Not really, it's not. It's actually what a lot of people call a really good angler, a guy who he can read the minds of fish for the day, go out, catch a bunch of fish, and have a great day. Nobody calls me that. Let's just be honest, nobody calls me that. A hog. Now, I have been called a hog before, but for different reasons. This is just another name for a really big bass. Depending on what part of the country you're coming from, you might call it one thing. Some guys call it a hog. A honey hole. Now we all have a honey hole where we can go and we can catch fish when we really need to catch fish. And it's just our favorite spot to go fishing that we have really good confidence in, and we know that there are fish there. A hump. And no, these aren't the lovely lady humps. This is a hump, an underwater hump, and it's just gonna be where a level change comes in underwater. So, you've got one water depth, and it comes up, and then it goes back down, out in the middle of the lake, or it could be even closer to shore, and it could be where like the river channel splits around and just leaves a hump. Ice fishing. Now, it's wintertime right now, and I thought I could go ice fishing out on the lake a few days ago. It was really cold, but here in Oklahoma, we don't do ice fishing. That's for you guys up north, and you guys are crazy because you go out there, you drill a hole, and you sit there for hours hoping for a bite in the freezing cold. I'll stick with my warmer weather fishing. Inactive fish. These are fish that just aren't active, so they're not interested in biting, and no matter what you throw at them, they're just not gonna bite. So don't hang around inactive fish. A jig. Now, a jig is probably the most versatile, best bass fishing lure that you can ever have, and it's just a lead head or sometimes a tungsten head on a hook. It's got a skirt, and guys put trailers on it, and we'll talk about that in a little bit later. The juice. Now, the juice is just a really hot spot. It's kind of like a honey hole, or you know, some guys might talk about it like he had the juice, he just had that touch. So it can mean like, you know, I found the juice, like a juicy spot, or it can mean like, hey, he's got the juice, he knows what he's doing, so go fishing with him. A keeper. Now, for tournament anglers, this usually means like a minimum length limit or a certain size bass. And for us guys who are just recreational anglers, that's usually the size that's legal keeping limit. So read your regulations, and if it's a keeper, it's gonna be bigger than the legal length limit to bring home. A laydown is similar to a brush pile, except a laydown you can actually see in the water, and it's just gonna be laying into the water, but part of it's going to be exposed, where a brush pile is typically fully submerged. A live well. A live well is just the little holding area that you keep fish so that they don't die immediately, and you can take them home and cook them or stick them in the live well and take them to weigh-ins. A lure. Now, a lure is just a man-made object that entices fish, specifically bass, to bite. Obviously other fish will bite it, but if we're talking bass here, that's what we're going after. Mono. It could be the disease that you get from kissing pretty girls, but in this case, we're talking about the shorthand for monofilament, which is another type of line, and it's probably the best line for beginners. Moon phases. This is actually, literally, we're talking about the moon because it actually has a lot to do with fishing, whether you agree with it or not. I've studied it, and I've come to the conclusion that the different moon phases affect the fish differently. Panfish. It's actually a general term, usually talking about bluegill or crappie or some various species in between. Those are panfish. It's just a generic term to cover a bunch of different species. A pattern. You might have heard guys say, hey, I established this pattern today. And that just means, hey, I figured out that the bass wanted my lure this way, under this circumstance, at this time. And it's just a pattern that they could repeat. They could go, you know, if it was on a dock, but it had to be the north corner of the dock, and they had to throw the jig, skip it right up underneath the north corner of the dock. Whatever the pattern was, that would be a pattern. Not your grandma's sewing pattern. PFD, wear it, personal flotation device. Never go on a boat without it, or a kayak or anything. I'm a huge stickler on this. I've known too many guys that fall over, hit their head, and never get to come home to their families because they were not wearing a PFD. So wear it all the time. I know sometimes it's uncomfortable, but being a little bit uncomfortable is a lot better than not coming home to your family at all. Wear it. A pier rat. I never use this term because I don't fish in a lot of piers, but it's literally just somebody who fishes from piers all the time, and only piers. A pig. This is just another term for a big bass. A pocket. And this ain't the pocket that you keep your money in or your phone in. This is a pocket in a cove, a pocket in an area. It's just a specific location within another location. So you're getting a little bit more specific. So, you know, I was fishing in the cove today, or I was fishing in the pocket of the cove today, and it's just a little indent into the cove a little bit more, or it could be a deep hole that's in the cove, but the pocket. A point, and not pointing a finger. This is a point on the lake, a point on the pond, a point on the river, whatever. Part of the land sticks way out into the water and comes to a point. And that's where a lot of fish like to hang out, is on the points underwater. Sometimes they might extend out farther than you think, so you might be fishing offshore farther than you think you should, but that's where the fish are going to be, is on the points. Power fishing. This is my favorite kind of fishing, and as I mentioned earlier, it's like throwing a crankbait, throwing a spinnerbait, and you're moving it pretty quickly along the water. You're using big, strong, heavy gear, casting a frog out on a stiff rod, popping it back. That's power fishing, not little dainty light tackle. You've got big, manly, strong tackle. Professional overrun. This is what I do sometimes. I don't backlash, I just get a little bit of professional overrun, even though they mean the same thing. Rip rap. This ain't like wicka 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 wah wah wah. You know, no, I can't rap, but you know, you get what I'm saying. It's not a rap. It's actually rocks that have been busted up and placed in a certain area, whether that's along dams a lot of the time is where they're at, or areas that wash out really bad. They place these busted up rocks here, and fish just congregate around them. They love them a lot of the time. So if you hear somebody talking about fishing riprap, it usually just means fishing around these big chunky rocks. School. This ain't the thing that everybody hated growing up. This is typically a school of fish, and that just means a big group of fish. That's what we call a big group of fish, is a school. I don't know why we had to name it that, but that's what they named it. Sight fishing. Now you hear this term a lot more during the spring when fish are moving up shallow, and it literally is just you looking into the water, seeing that fish, casting your lure to it, and catching it. That's sight fishing. A snag. We've all been there. Let's just take a moment to admit it. We've all snagged on something. You get hung up. You can call it hung up, you can call it snagged, whatever. But you lose your favorite lure because you got hung up on a tree, you got snagged on a branch, or you got snagged on a really big fish and it broke your line. Snag. Soft plastics. This is the rubbery plastic materials that are used to make fishing lures. There's all kinds of different ones, from worms to beaver tail style creature baits, flukes, which look more like a minnow. You've got paddle tails. There's all kinds of different ones. Soft plastics. The spawn. This is the time of year when the bass are making love. That's all I got. It's the spawn. They're loving on each other, making babies. A spinning reel. Now we talked about the bail of the spinning reel earlier, but this is just the reel itself. It's a little bit different than a bait caster. Spinning reel, you've got to open up the bail and cast it out, and the line spins on it this way, where a bait caster spins on it this way. It's just a different type of fishing reel, typically used for finesse fishing and not power fishing. Standing timber. This is when you see trees, whether they're alive or dead, in the water, and they're not falling over. That's a laydown. These are still standing. Standing timber. Structure. Now structure is another general term. It can mean a cliff face, it can mean a brush pile sometimes, or it can mean a rock pile. Structure is just something that the bass congregate around. It's underwater, and it's an area where you find a lot of fish. Suspended fish. Now this isn't like you getting suspended from school. This is like the fish are suspended in the water column. So they're not at the top of the water and they're not at the bottom either. They're somewhere in the middle. That's a bunch of suspended fish. They're typically a little bit harder to catch, and you typically need electronics to find them, but that's what a suspended fish is. Terminal tackle. It's literally just your hooks and your sinkers. Maybe you might consider your bobbers, your swivels, all terminal tackle, but generally speaking, it's your hooks and your sinkers. A transition. Now this is one of the best places to fish because you're transitioning from deep to shallow or shallow to deep, however you want to look at it. And this is where fish generally hang out the most, is in these transition areas. So an area going from shallow water to deep, or deep water to shallow water, that in between those two is the transition. The trolling motor. Now this isn't the guy on the internet with a motor trolling people. This is the motor on the front of your boat that's battery powered, and it's really quiet, used to sneak up on fish a lot better than the big 250 on the back of the boat. Top water lure. It's literally any lure that is on top of the water, whether you're popping it, whether you're reeling it back, whatever you've got to do with it. It's just a lure that stays on top of the water to entice fish. It usually imitates like an injured fish, or like if it's a buzz bait, it just annoys the crap out of them until they bite. And last but not least is the wacky rig. It's probably one of my favorite rigs just to go to. It's kind of a finesse tactic. You got to fish it a lot slower than you want to, but it's literally just when you take your hook and hook it in between or in the middle of your plastic worm, cast it out there and let it sink slowly. I typically don't add any weight to it unless I'm trying to fish it really deep. So now that you're fluent in fishing terms, you actually need to learn and understand all the fishing lures. Lucky for you, I've got a video down below me right now that's going to teach you about all the bass fishing lures, the best times to use them, and which ones you actually need as a beginner. And until then, I want you to remember that education is important, but fishing is essential.